In 1996, I am being driven from Princeton to Princeton Junction by a colleague at Princeton. He's an elderly man, and he deposits me at the station. And as he's depositing me at the station, out of friendship, we've been talking. He tells me that his father has, his widowed father, recently widowed father, has found his ex-girlfriend and is going to marry her. It turns out that she was his girlfriend from way back in school. She too is widowed. As it turns out, he is a Jew who had left as a child Russia and settled in Glasgow in Scotland. Turns out she too was a Jew from Russia whose parents had settled in Glasgow in Scotland. They get married, and his friend says to me something that I thought was quite unusual. He said, funny, I mean, how do you get married to someone that you've loved 50 years before and continued to love? Because the marriage that you had was not a happy one, certainly not rewarding. And then he says something that truly unseated me. He said, it's funny, my parents had the wrong marriage. I, however, am the product of the wrong marriage, but I'm fully able to understand the beauty of their relationship that has suddenly been resurrected. And I felt sort of yanked by that, because I was wondering, can you still be happy when you have all these years that may have been mistaken years, mistaken lives, unhappy lives? What do you do with that time that you spent in the wrong place, in the wrong marriage? And how do you live with this if you're the son? Feeling happy on one hand too, because you've inherited their unhappiness and you're the product of their unhappiness. And it turns out that they did live a few happy years in their very late 70s. Now, this friend also tells me there's a book you should read. It's by a gentleman called Sebald. I'd never heard of Sebald. This is 1996. The book had just been published in England and in America, and I had no sense of who this person was. He said, you should read it, you might like it. I said, fine. Okay, I said, one of those perfunctory fines, yeah, sure. But I took him at his word, particularly because the publisher of the Emigrants, it's this book here, the publisher of this book in England, was the same publisher of my own book, which happens to be on a similar subject about people who are displaced, or, if you wish, deracinated. I read the book, and I liked it, and I reviewed it, and I gave it a very positive review. What happened, though, is that this is 1996, and in another sort of Sebaldian move, if I may, let's move back to 1946. So we're moving half a century before this meeting. It's even before my birth, this meeting. And we are dealing with a friend of mine who one day, notice how this sort of mimics almost Sebald, tells me about his father. He says, do you happen to know who my father is? I said, I don't know who your father is. He said, my father is called Martin Ostwald. Martin Ostwald happened, yes, I knew who Martin Ostwald was because he had translated the most popular, most famous version of Aristotle's Nicomachean Ethics. And I had studied from that book, so I knew the book. And I said, my God, I didn't know that this was the same Ostwald as your father. I was very sad. Well, my father happened to have been had a lucky story because he was one of the lucky kids who got out of Germany during the war, before the war, or let's say immediately before the war, and that his parents had sent him on a Kindertransport to England with his elder brother. The elder brother is not insignificant to the story. They arrive, and as they're leaving Germany, the mother and the father say, we'll join you soon. We will try to get out of Germany in our own way. And the kids leave, and as it turns out, they settle in England. They're harbored in England. They're taken care of. However, when the war breaks out, the elder brother, who is of age, is interned in a camp as a German national. Okay, they didn't make the distinction between Jewish and not. And so he is interned, but the younger brother decides that he doesn't want to have the same fate and takes the opportunity to go to Canada, where he studies and becomes a scholar. But what happened is that you have these two brothers, one in England and will stay in England forever, and the other in America, or in Canada first and then America, and will stay on the Western Hemisphere forever. Now, on the eve of his doctoral exams, and this is true, Martin Oswald, it's 1946, Martin Oswald, who is now a PhD student, receives a letter from his mother. It is dated, I'm not going to tell you the date, but it's written from Theresienstadt. And the mother says, you know, we're here, it's very difficult in Theresienstadt, it's not what we thought it was going to be, and many of our friends are here, so it's good to have them, but they're all doing very badly, and Daddy, by the way, died, and I'm still strong, but it's really wearing me down. I'm trying to feel for what this man must have felt, and I think that Sebald loved the idea. This man receives a letter, and it's dated 1944. So he knows that his mother is no longer alive. But he must have felt on holding a letter, as he claims, he told me this, when he held the letter in his hand, he thought that for a second that his mother was well, that she wasn't dead. Anyway, that story just baffled me and sort of moved me to the point where what he's ended up doing is he translated the long letter that his mother wrote to him into English and sort of didn't publish it, but showed it to many people. He showed it to me too. Now, I felt that there was something there. The fact that the sons receive a letter from their mother, as in The Emigrants, you have a son who also gets his mother's diary and reads it. That these are transplanted people in England and America. I thought that maybe Martin Oswald might like to read The Emigrants. So I sent it to him. I sent him a copy of The Emigrants. It turns out that not only Martin, but his wife, Laura Oswald, who also, as it turns out, happens to have been rescued by a kinder transport, reads the book, and before even finishing it, she recognizes a name in it, the Wallerstein family. And she says, Andre, could you please give me his email address or his address, because I need to write to him. And I'm going to myself, oh God, another author is going to get a letter from an old lady telling him how much she's moved and how much she knew the characters in question. But I do that. She writes to him a wonderful letter. He replies. And she says, and by the way, I didn't tell you that the Wallerstein family, blah, 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 blah. This is also true about it. And so eventually, after a year of this, actually quite intense correspondence between a writer who basically puts himself out there for them, they develop a friendship. And in the course of the friendship, Martin Oswald tells him about the letter that he received from his mother, describing Theresienstadt in quite fluent details. Sebald jots down next to the letter, makes notes of the things that he's going to borrow in Austerlitz from that letter, which I think is amazing. And he also, Martin Oswald, who's a scholar, tells him, by the way, there's a writer called Adler, who, and you will all hear about Adler because he's being published now very enthusiastically, partly by, I think, Random House, and I forget who else publishes Adler, but it's doing very well. And there's a biography of Adler that's being written right as we're speaking. And he tells him about Adler, and of course, for those of you who read Austerlitz, you know that there's a mention of Adler as a survivor from Theresienstadt. So the contribution of Martin Auster, so this totally happenstance series of events to Austerlitz is significant, but here's the problem, and this is how we're going to tackle Austerlitz. It is significant, but I cannot put my finger on what it means. In other words, these series of what I don't even want to call them coincidences suggest some kind of order or symmetry in the universe that we know does not exist. All right? And so one has to ponder this, and maybe you can all help me unravel this puzzle, because we know it cannot be. I'm at Princeton, I'm a writer, somebody drives me, tells me about his mother and father finally meeting, but telling me that they've led the wrong life, the wrong marriage. I'm the product of a wrong marriage, and therefore I must be the wrong person. Telling me about Sebald, who's also writing about people who are living the wrong life. The concept of a wrong life. Now, I know that if you go and see a shrink, he's going to tell you absolutely there is no such thing as a wrong life. They're all right lives, but aesthetically, we're in a different dimension. But the real issue is, it's so easy to say that Austerlitz and everything that Sebald writes is from sinister to depressive. Okay? But you cannot use that. Those are clinical terms. They're inappropriate because what he does with his depression, or what he does with this fundamentally dark and almost gothic dimension in his work, is that he transforms it aesthetically into something else, and it means something aesthetically, and it will not let us go because it has reached us through the aesthetic medium, telling me that it's a story about a depressed person who happens to be witness all these Holocaust survivors, or who bemoans the death of Holocaust survivors, doesn't work. That's not the point. Okay? But what I thought initially was, this is a rather sweet tale, isn't it? A German writer who is transplanted, by the way, and living in England for his whole life almost, is making friends with a German Jewish couple who are transplanted in the US. They have never gone back to Germany, and he's visiting them, and they correspond, though they're both fluent in German, in English. So you notice how gnarled all the oxymorons are. There's a meaning, again, that's being suggested to us, even in the accidental fact of these two people. So there's a part of me that said, okay, this is such a sweet tale about a nostalgic German Jew in the United States befriending a German who happens to be nice to Jews. Okay? It sounds almost pat, doesn't it? Doesn't it? There's something too neat about it, too facile. And it cannot be, that cannot be the story. And I can't live with that, so it doesn't make me happy. Inasmuch as I look at the situation between Sebald and the Ostwalds, and I realize that both of them are reaching out to some kind of, I hate the word and never use it in your papers, it's a horrible word, some sense of redemption, or maybe even closure. I hate that word, okay? Because, I mean, what is closure, if you think about it? It means nothing. It's like an account. Are we accounting books that we need closure? No, absolutely doesn't work this way. But I'm going to read to you one sentence from The Emigrants. The course of my life, down to the tiniest detail, was ordained not only by the deportation of my parents to the East, but also by the delay with which the news of their death reached me. This is Sebald trying to, it's from The Emigrants. He's trying to make sense of what is it that Max Weber, the character here, is grappling with. Is his life ruined because his parents were basically sent to the camps? Or is his life also ruined by the fact that the news of their death, which he knew had happened, because he had to have assumed it did, the news of their death came to him tardily, sort of delayed. And this is reading this one sentence told me that Martin Ostwald, my friend's father, needed to read this book because that sentence for me encapsulated everything about his reception of his mother's letter. Now, do you like the story of a reconciliation between a German and a Jew? I've poisoned the well already, as it is, okay? So you're supposed to say no, okay? And I used to think, and I thought this for a few years, that in Sebald's case, the Holocaust was a convenient prop, a metaphor that allows him to go into a discussion about some issues that he cannot quite grapple with outside of that metaphor. And I like to use the word mordant. I mean, I don't know how many of you know what a mordant is. How many of you are dyers? Well, you would know. If you're a dyer, before you dye a cloth, you have to apply a particular chemical so that the chemical will it's like glue. It will bite into the color and keep it there. Maybe the Holocaust was just a convenient mordant, something that would allow him to expound on what is troubling and what is affecting his depression. And then I thought, but this is really weird, because the Holocaust, yeah, of course it's a terrible thing, and I understand, blah, blah, blah. But then he starts talking about buildings, and I'm going to read to you some quotes about the buildings, and what is the problem with buildings. What troubles him about buildings? He likes old buildings, and you've noticed that, haven't you? I mean, he goes into old stations. He likes the fact that the station is itself built on something that has a history to it, which is basically a nut house, crazy place, bedlam. It's built right on top of that. So he loves the fact that there's an archaeology, that there's excavation that is going to happen. And so I said, okay, to use a word that another German writer has used, a fellow called Gregor von Ritzori. I don't know how many of you have heard of him. He likes to use the word erstwhileness, which is a nice and sort of labored way of speaking about nostalgia. In other words, you can accuse Sebald of being an erstwhiler, if there is such a thing. He likes to seek out things that had an erstwhile inscribed or embedded in them. Oh, that worked for me. Yeah, now I can hate him. Okay. But then I said, no, that's not going to work. It's not about erstwhileness. The buildings are old, but they're also defunctive. There's something happening in buildings for Sebald that allows him to explore something, and I bet you it has something to do with identity, with selfness, with maybe the word identity may be totally wrong, because identity means that you have one. What happens if you don't have an identity, but you have something called a self? Let me read to you some quotations that I've gotten from Austerlitz. Outsized buildings already cast the shadow of their own destruction and are designed with a view of their later existence as ruins. Now, this really troubles me because I don't understand it, but I know it means something. Very often, when you're dealing with a great writer, they will say things that you say, I agree, I feel it, I don't understand it. And that's, I think, the magic of language, is to bring you to that point where you pushed to a degree where sense and meaning are not necessarily coeval. If you think of the Colosseum, and don't think of a train station, the Colosseum was already designed as something that would exist as a ruin. I mean, when you look at the Empire State Building, well, let's not talk about Twin Towers, but if you look at the Empire State Building, you are seeing something that could conceivably become a ruin, even if it stands, because it's already there. You can notice the ruin already taking place. But let me read to you some more of these. This is on page 136. I could not stop wondering whether it was a ruin or a building in the process of construction that I had entered. And on page 138, it vanished in its rebuilding. Page 24, the world is draining itself and leaves no record. And the question on 227, risen from the ground or sunk into it? This is a baffling one. Is this rising from the ground, or is it actually in the process of sinking into it? And the answer, of course, is I don't know. What do you think that Sebald is trying to sort of edge towards? He's sort of pointing at, nudging us to accept. Why this interest in, I do think that he has an obsession with buildings, big buildings that bespeak a time of their own grandeur, as when he goes to the hotel in Marienbad and he's walking through and basically all the rooms are closed. By the way, he does this in all his books. Every one of his books has a grand hotel or a grand building that now still exists. It's not totally dead, but essentially a couple of rooms are there and the restaurant is not working today. But anyway, but it's like you have this universe in this function. And in The Emigrants, I'll give you a quote to that same effect. The buildings that had been put up to stave off the general decline in Manchester were now themselves in the grip of decay. The buildings that are built to forestall any kind of decay are themselves now in the process of decaying. But this is something we live with. I mean, we live with this, and it affects us. We all like the old monuments, ugly as they can be, because some of the old monuments are terrible to even to behold. I mean, we all sort of bemoan the demolition of, what is it, Penn Station. I never saw the original, but I saw pictures of it. It's not that great, okay? It wasn't that beautiful. What are we talking about? Okay, so it's demolished. Nobody thought much about it. Okay, now they're going to destroy the post office. They're going to convert it, which is sort of the sister building across. And that's not such a great building either. Okay? And in fact, we used to say, and what's her name? I forget her first name, Huxtable. She used to think that the Twin Towers were ugly. And she was right. They were very, very ugly. But that's not the issue. The issue is that some of these buildings, and we're going to talk about this, have time inscribed on them. Time becomes what Benjamin will call an aura. You know, it resonates with something more than just masonry and more than just people. But to go back to the fact that Sebald himself talks about himself in the book, when he has these bouts of depression, I'm talking about Austerlitz, he does mention something, I withdrew into myself. But then he says something like, it turning away from myself, as if the process of obliteration is almost being invoked. Which of the two is it? Are you withdrawing into yourself, like, okay? Or am I just dissipating myself? Which of the two is it going to be? So that you can begin to see that the way he speaks about masonry is not too different from the manner in which he discusses identity. And that's why I used my accusation that this thing is all about nostalgia is invalid, because it is aesthetically undergirding the whole work. That we are all the things that he will touch, down to butterflies, are all written about their disappearance blended into their possible appearance. And to the point where I believe that the idea of a hotel, any hotel in Sebald, as you probably know by now, any hotel is going to be a hotel that was once great and is now terrible, but has not died yet. But we're dealing with, I mean, the key words for me are disappearance, or say the process of disappearance, dissolution, evanescence, you're disappearing. And at the same time, this disappearance is not complete because there's also, as the disappearance is occurring, there's a kind of, not inchoacy, but more a sort of this thing which you can call perduration. It is enduring. It's not going away. And it's as if he cannot make up his mind which of the two is occurring or which of the two is actually attracting him as a writer, as a man who's crafting a novel. Am I interested in what is visibly going away but has not gone away? Or am I interested in something that is enduring but totally imperfectly? And there's no way to decide which of the two it is. And you're not supposed to decide, because when I started the talk about Martin Oswald, I said that there is a moment that must have occurred to Martin Oswald when he was holding the letter. It might have lasted for a second, but it must have lasted when he thought that his mother was alive, only to be jolted a second later by the realization that his mother is dead anyway. And it's that synapse between the two that is the space in which Sebald will be writing and has written all his work. It's the space between what you thought was going to happen to what has happened but may not yet happen. Those of you who've been in my class, you know very well that I call this the irrealis sort of spectrum. It's a zone that does not exist, but that does exist in our minds. Okay? And that could exist and should exist, as Aristotle says, but that might never exist, unfortunately, though you don't know, it might yet come about. Okay? And you can play with this all the time, and this is exactly the zone that Sebald inhabits. I always start one of my courses with a short story by Sebald, because I think it contains everything he's ever done. I mean, that's what happens. All writers write a short thing that contains everything they will ever do, and which is fine. There's nothing wrong with that. The issue is that he does this every single time without tiring me, which is the irony of it. Why does it not tire me? Because I know where he's going with this. And by the time you get to half of Austerlitz, you already know where this is going to go. Okay, there's no surprise. And I said that these buildings have time inscripted in them, which is a very complex idea. In other words, you look at things and you say, my God, 1,000 years ago, people were walking in this same exact route. Think of any palace you've seen where you have that feeling. In other words, I am just a nothing walking in a place where for 2,000 years people have been walking. You go to the Acropolis and you feel that way right away. My steps, there's not a single pebble or a single grain of sand that has not been walked over by millions of people here. I am nothing. Okay, so there's a sense of that you exist in time, and it's one of those things that used to really, really trouble a man called Stendhal, whom Sebald likes a great deal, because he just couldn't deal with the idea that there was so much time around him, living in Rome and Civitavecchia, that he experienced this vis-a-vis beauty, but he was troubled by the experience that time is everywhere. Everywhere I turn, there is too much time. And you begin to think about, if you think about time, you begin to think, okay, the typical thing about time is that some people are born at the wrong time, which happens. I mean, if you're born in Germany in 1929 and you happen to be 18 in 30, no, you can't be. Let's do the math for me, whatever it is, okay. You're born in the wrong time, especially if you're Jewish, okay? You're born in the wrong time, in the wrong place. And there's a sense of wrong place in everything that Sebald writes. Manchester is the wrong place for the man in The Emigrants. You have a sense that all the towns that are visited by Austerlitz are the wrong towns. times, the wrong places. There is no right there. But there's also the fact that everything is the wrong time. And so you say, well, what's the issue here? And one of the things that I like to toy with is to say that maybe what he's really discussing, it's not the wrong time or the wrong place, but maybe life is wrong. You know, there's a problem with living that might be a big mistake. In other words, the death instinct, as Freud would say, is inscribed in us. Not that this is real, that life is the wrong thing, but when you think about it in terms of Sebaldian, the terms that he uses, you have to come to the conclusion that it's not time that is the wrong thing, it's not place that is the wrong thing, it's life that is the wrong thing. Now that makes sense to me because that absolves time and it absolves space and place. It's living that is wrong. On page 212, he says, "At some time in the past, I thought I must have made a mistake, and now I am living the wrong life." It's what I've been saying. At some point in the past, I have made a mistake, and now I am living the wrong life. Think about that for a second. To live the wrong life, that is anathema to us, especially in America, where, first of all, you always have a second chance, correct? Don't you always have second chances? You messed up the first time, you messed up the second, the third, you still have another fourth chance. There's always another chance in there. At least that's what we tell ourselves. But then sometimes you say, I went to graduate school, I made a mistake, and now I'm living the wrong life. See, they're all laughing, okay. No, but what I'm saying, it's not just the wrong career, the wrong place, the wrong time, the wrong people. Things can be wrong, and you are sort of condemned by them, by this weight of and finally, you didn't even make a mistake. You're just saying you made a mistake. In fact, you made no choice. There was nothing that you made wrong. It's just that life turned out to be the wrong life. And it's a damning way of looking at life. And I mean, for those of, how many of you have heard him speak or seen him on YouTube or whatever? He's quite, not depressed, but there's something despondent about him. So it's a real sort of 19th century melancholia in the voice, in the timbre of the voice, in the delivery of what he's reading. He's a sad man, okay? And at some point he was asked, who said that? I read it somewhere. I might have read it in the foreword by James Wood, that he was asked, do you translate your own work? And he says, no, I never do that. And he said, why don't you do that? Because his English is flawless. And he has a hand in the translation. In other words, he corrects the translator. He says, well, because I don't have that much time left. Okay, I mean, this is a man who lives exactly what he was telling us. And he didn't say it with any sadness. He was just being himself. So you have a sense that not just the place and the time and the life is wrong, but that even the very concept of identity is skittish. It skids. It's not in a particular direction. It doesn't inhabit a particular groove. Even the sense of identity itself is almost a construction that allows us to talk about our name and our profession and our faces that we see in the mirror, but that's not who we really are. And in fact, if you think about it, if I took your name, your profession, your religion, your nationality, everything away, and I didn't kill you, but I took everything else away, you wouldn't know who you are. You would become one of these characters like Austerlitz, who has no name. He has the wrong name for a while. He has the wrong memories. He doesn't remember his parents. He doesn't remember anything. And he walks into a station and has a sort of a, what do you want to call it? What shall we call it? An epiphany? That's a nice way to call it, okay? What does he have? And suddenly he begins to recollect stuff. It suddenly comes to him. In fact, the first time I read the book, I sort of had a sense that this is where it was going, and I felt very annoyed. I'm talking about this is when the book came out. I felt annoyed because I said, he's not going to do something like suddenly the boys, because you know the kid is a Kindertransport, okay? You know it's going to happen, and you keep saying, I hope it's not going to be a Madeleine, okay? I hope it's not going to be this. I hope it's not. How is he going to come up with how is he going to discover his family, okay? And so he has a major sort of, whatever you want to call it, the phantasmagoric experience in a station that is being demolished, correct? And there are secret rooms, as there are secret chambers in our heads, you know, that we haven't explored, and suddenly they're rammed open, and suddenly this effluvia comes out, and it's his parents, and he suddenly remembers, and gradually he remembers. The word that comes to me is ghost. These characters, I mean, what is a ghost to you? A ghost is somebody who is dead, who comes back, correct? Who walks among the living, correct? Isn't that what a ghost is? What if a ghost is seeking something? Why would it be back unless it's seeking something? Don't you think? What does it want? It has to want something, otherwise it wouldn't be among us. But then you also have a sense that the cities themselves, I mean, these characters in Sebald and in all his books are people who are sort of trundling along life, seeking something that they have no idea what it is. It could be an identity. It could be some kind of closure to an ongoing, mystifying, and paralyzing sense of their own lives. And the word in Italian is lost soul. You have the same thing, lost souls. They're lost souls. In other words, they're dead, but they're still among us. And you have to wonder, what is it that they want? Why are they here for? When will they go away? Okay, again, I'm using metaphorical language because but they're also happen to live with us in a space that for them is almost like a ghost city. All these old buildings suddenly make sense to us because they're all sort of ghost buildings, aren't they? And basically, when he visits Theresienstadt, what is it but a ghost town? The picture shows nobody there. And so you're dealing there with a sense that the city, the buildings, and the people themselves are like hovering near. I mean, they're not dead, but they're not living. In fact, one of the faults that I found with Sebald when I first read him, and I knew I liked it a lot, but I was also sensing there are no relationships in Sebald. I mean, what kind of a relationship is we sit in a cafe and says Austerlitz, blah, 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 says Austerlitz that so-and-so said such and such was quoted as saying, I mean, is that a relationship? I don't know. I mean, it's not even a friendship. It's almost a sounding board. Sebald, have become a sounding board to Mr. Austerlitz, who's telling me his story, and some of the stories he's overheard from other people, whose stories now I'm transcribing. You know, but there are no relations. I'm talking about sexual relations, amorous relations. You can feel there is no desire anywhere in this novel. But maybe something might have, maybe just a kiss on the cheek or something that doesn't exist. And if you go to page 132, it's there. As for me, said Austerlitz, I felt at this time as if the dead were returning from their exile and filling the twilight around me with their strangely slow but incessant toing and froing. Now let me read you the same scene from another book. I have returned to it time and again because, looking at the pictures in it, it truly seemed to me, and still does, as if the dead were coming back, or as if we were going to on the point of joining them. And so, as he likes to say at the end of the first story, which is the one I like the best, and so they are ever coming back to us, comma, the dead. In other words, that demarcation between living and dying, we all know there's a difference, but that's not the point. The point is that the memory of the dead has not gone away, and it's as if the dead are with us still. You get a lot of references to the actual fading of the colors, the fading of things, the fading of identity, the fading of buildings, the fading of cities. Everything is in a process of fading, and it becomes a sort of a staple. And if you think about it, this is pretty much brilliant, because he's flirting with the reader. In other words, stimulating the reader to say, yes, I know, something like, yes, I know this is about the Holocaust, and we both know this is about the Holocaust, but I'm not tipping my cards yet. Okay? I'm putting you in the mood of someone who is beginning to discover his interest in his own past by looking at what you might call the objective correlative of the Holocaust. The disappearance of an entire world whose characters are staring at you wide-eyed, exactly as he says at the end of The Emigrants, for those of you where he sees a picture of these people in Theresienstadt who are factory workers and being taken pictures of and are already dead by the time the picture is even developed, and who are staring wide-eyed like the three fates at the photographer. Okay, so there's a sense of this is just an intimation of what is about to come in the book. Let's say you're visiting a psychologist, okay, an analyst or whatever, and you walk in and he brings out sort of Vyatka dolls, you know, those Russian dolls, and they're standing there in front of him on his desk as you're unburdening yourself. At some point, do you not say, you know, it's funny, I'm talking about my issues and you have those dolls there, and maybe there's a correlation between them and me. I mean, you're kind of tugged, but very delicately, to the point where you're not realizing it, because what he's doing is he's working inside of you. Yeah. Austerlitz has lost his memory. His whole life is submerged. So, I mean, you could say that the world that he comes from has been totally eradicated, but his memory of that world is also eradicated. So it doesn't exist. But as Sebald tells us, the dead have ways of coming up to us and fading away, and we go out to them and they come up to us, and we could be more dead than they are, or we could be more dead than alive, and they could be more alive than dead, and we don't know the difference. So it's essentially, that's how he works, and that's why you can say it is musical in so many ways, precisely because it gives you the theme, but it's not declared, and you have to pick it up. And one of the things that I do in my other course, when we do the first story of the Emigrants, it's about a kid who grew up to become a doctor. His name is Dr. Selwyn, and everything is fine. He became wealthy being a doctor, etc., etc. And then you realize that this whole story, it never mentions it once, is about the Holocaust. This is a person who escaped the Holocaust by virtue, may I call it a coincidence. He ended up in England before the Holocaust was even anything. And he was on his way to America, but he stopped in England, and that's why he had to make a living. That's what he accepted as his life, and it is the wrong life. Now, what is the right life? Being in America? Accepting the life you have in England? Or is the right life, pardon me for saying that, is the right life staying in Ukraine and being rounded up and killed by the Nazis? Okay? If you're speaking about the wrong life, which is a motif in Sebald, then which of the three, of these three, is the right life? And you have no answer. Because in essence, and that's why I always say that the Holocaust in Sebald is not just an excuse to write about the past or to make amends for his German past. His father was in the army, by the way. I don't know if James Wood says that or not, but it's a known fact. But you don't know which of the three it is, just as you don't know, are these people more dead than alive, or are the dead more alive than dead? You don't know. But you don't know for a very good reason, because he doesn't want to spell it out. Because spelling it out ruins it. There is nothing to spell out. And I want to look at two passages. One is on page 102, actually. The leafless trees on the slopes of the park were already deep in the shadows rising from the earth, semicolon. Before us, at the foot of the hill, was the broad square of turf, black as night and crossed diagonally by two pale sandy paths, and the white facades and colonnades of the National Maritime Museum. And on the Isle of Dogs, on the far side of the river, the sparkling glass towers rose above the rapidly gathering darkness in the last of the daylight. Now let me go to page 112. Now, you see it at the line 10 or something? There was something fleeting, evanescent about those sparse patterns appearing in constant succession on the pale surface, something which never went beyond the moments of its generation, so to speak. Yet here in the intertwining of sunlight and shadow, always forming and reforming, you could see mountainous landscapes and glaciers and ice fields, high plateaus, steppes, deserts, fields full of flowers, islands in the sea, coral reefs, archipelagos and atolls. I don't know what an atoll is. I don't know. Forests bending to the form, quaking grass and drifting smoke. And once I remember, said Austerlitz, as we gazed together at the slowly fading world, Adela leaned towards me and asked, do you see the fronds of the palm trees? Do you see the caravan coming through the dunes over there? Okay. Notice, I mean, this is amazing prose. You would not be allowed to write such prose today. No magazine will publish this prose, unless, of course, it wants to make a point. And it's what? John, what do you think? You give it a shot. You would. Okay, great. Okay, there's a future then. Okay. No, but the point is that this is amazing prose. I mean, it's Miltonian. Now, if I were teaching a class on Proust and I had a sentence like this is the most un-Proustian sentence ever written. It's long. James could never be capable of writing such a sentence because he's not a good craftsman. That's my view. Okay. But neither would Virginia Woolf. She wouldn't be able to do this. This is sustained, and of course, what carries it is the fact that he names all those peculiar places and forests and steppes, etc., etc. But do you think he needed to say all these things? He wants to create a rhythm, and he wants the rhythm. The rhythm exists in everything. And notice how he blends the rhythm with the said Austerlitz. And Adela said it. Okay. In other words, everything is underwritten by this rhythm, which for me, and you may disagree with me, and please disagree. For me, it's not just a rhythm and a cadence that is specific to him, but it's a rhythm that has meaning. And I think the meaning that it has, if I can give it a sort of a easy label, it tries to imitate the flow of water, if I may, the flow of time. This is a particular kind of cadence which is not just meditative, which it is, but at the same time what it tries to do is it's almost like beating to a very specific rhythm, and the rhythm is the one of time. And for me, it's as if the rhythm, the time factor, which is a very very pertinent subject of this book, not only inhabits it as a topic of the book, but it is there in its very matrix, in its very skeleton. Time inhabits everything, even the way people speak. Now, you will notice that an editor today will say, people don't speak like this. When he reports what somebody has said at length, he's not reporting it as in other words, he's not interested in reporting exactly how it might have been spoken. He's more interested in sort of suffusing whatever is being spoken into the text so that everything is as I said, underscored by the same exact tempo, and the tenor is identical. Now, I wanted to end this talk with a personal encounter that I had with Sebald. When I first reviewed his first book, it was, I was totally enamored, and I wrote a fantastic review, and I received in the mail, at my Princeton address at the time, an envelope, and in it was a postcard. It was an antique postcard. How many of you have seen, you go to an antique store, they have antique postcards. This was an antique postcard of the city of my birth, Alexandria. And I said, oh, how cute, Alexandria. And I look at the back of the card, and somebody had actually sent this postcard in 1905. Okay, that's fine, because it's an old postcard, it's an antique postcard. But it was also written in black ink, in the typical black ink that Sebald writes. He said, thank you very much for the review. I'm reading your book and enjoying it tremendously, whatever it is, a polite little thing. But how typical, how true to form for Sebald to send me a postcard of Alexandria that dates back to 1905, 1910, with the old language in pencil, and with his own writing in black ink and his typical cursive handwriting that he had, basically almost reaching out not in his own voice, but in his own literary voice. In other words, it's that when Proust wrote a letter to somebody, he wasn't being Marcel Proust. He was just writing you a little billet, and that was it. Whereas when Sebald, when he writes to you, he writes in a way that evokes who he is as a writer, not because he wants to show off, but because this is how he makes meaning happen. And one of the things that meant a great deal to me when I received that card is he is speaking to me from his book. It says, and I think that's the experience that the Ostwalds, who are now dead, had when they corresponded with Sebald. He was writing to them because they were fans, but he was also writing to them from his book, which I think is the most beautiful thing an artist can do when, rather than paying you money, they draw on your menu and give you something of their art to you. Okay. Thank you very much. Thank you.